20 more seconds here or so while people file in, and then we'll get started. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. I'll now get started introducing our speaker for today's energy symposium. Before I do, I will remind everyone of upcoming talks. Next week is our spring break, so there will be no talk for next week, next Tuesday. In 2 Tuesdays from now, on March 23rd, we'll have our own Michael Young from the Bureau of Economic Geology here at University of Texas. And he will speak about the land energy nexus in Texas and talk about essentially land cover and land development associated with energy production in the state of Texas. But today it's my pleasure to announce our speaker, Tiago Domingos. Tiago is going to tell us about energy and the understanding of economic growth. He is associate professor at the University of Lisbon in the School of Engineering at what's known as the Institute, well, the IST at the University of Lisbon. And he is trained, has lots of background in both engineering, physical sciences, and economics. And so we're going to hear some of that today when he talks to us about the central puzzle in the theory of economic growth. So we're going to learn a little bit about economic growth theory and how energy is or is not normally treated in that context. Tiago's degrees are in engineering physics and environmental engineering, and he teaches on thermodynamics, modeling, economics, and sustainable development. And he also has a spin-off company and founder of the spin-off Terraprima, which provides environmental services. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tiago here. Stop sharing my screen. And I will remind everyone to ask questions at any time in the Q&A feature of the webinar. And if the question is relevant during the middle of the talk, I will ask it to Tiago, and then otherwise we'll also have questions at the end. So with that said, Tiago, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Kerry, and thank you for this opportunity to present the work that we've been doing to this seminar. And so let me dive into it, start sharing the presentation. With this title, Energy, the Key to Understanding Economic Growth. Why are we interested in economic growth? Well, economic growth has been clearly the main driver of both increasing human prosperity and increasing environmental impact in the last few centuries. And if we don't have an adequate understanding of it, we can't manage it in our transition towards sustainability. On the one hand, however, in the last decades, economic growth has been slowing down. And by the last decades, I mean since the 1970s. And as stated here, it is for unknown reasons. It's not something that economists really understand why it has been slowing down. And on the other hand, the sustainability transition, namely associated to climate change, but also to other environmental impacts, requires that GDP be decoupled from environmental impact. So if we are to keep on having increasing economic growth, it will have to occur in such a way that it is no longer associated to increasing environmental impact. Otherwise, something that I will not explore here, well, although what I will talk about has implications for the possibility that if we cannot decouple GDP from environmental impact, then it might be the case that we can no longer have a continued economic growth. And what I'll try to do here is shed light on these issues by looking at economic growth from a thermodynamic point of view. So from the point of view of energy transformation, entropy reduction, and so on. Okay, so how do economists look at economic growth? Well, sorry, let me just switch to a pointer that you can easily see. Okay, here we are. So economic activity is measured with something that everyone has heard about and that we keep hearing about, which is GDP, gross domestic product. And the way economists describe how economic output is generated is by using something called an aggregate production function, aggregate because it applies to all of the economy, and a production function because it tells us how GDP is produced as a function of the so-called primary factors of production, which are physical capital, machines, etc., and human labor, people employed and working. If you see here the case for Portugal, and I will use Portugal along this talk as an example because all the ideas that I will be showing here have been cohesively and coherently developed for the case of Portugal, although there are many other of part of the results and part of the insights that I will be showing you have been found for many other countries, namely the United States, several countries in Europe, China, Mexico, and so on. But it is in fact only for Portugal that we have the full story in the way that I'm going to tell it to you. Okay, so here you see for the last 50 years, 50 to 60 years in Portugal, starting in the 1960s, what happened to gross domestic product. And well, you see it basically grew. In fact, it grew to 5.5 times more than it was in 1960, meaning that Portugal now has creation of economic value and economic output, which is 5.5 times higher than it was in 1960. And in tandem with this increase, we have an increase in capital stock, and which is in fact roughly proportional. So along all of this time, the set of machines, buildings, vehicles, etc. that exist in Portugal always have a monetary value which is around triple that of GDP. If you want to look at the labor force, which here we measure, and you see it here along the same time period and measured as million hours worked, you see that it had somewhat, in fact, it initially had a decrease, then somewhat of an increase, and then again a small decrease. So overall, a small increase, but comparatively small in comparison to what's happening with GDP. Now, another view of GDP, and which is very relevant, is GDP is not only the value of all the economic output that happens in a country in a year, but at the same time, and this is what you see now here expressed, GDP, which we will also denote with the letter Y, you have to think that GDP is money that is paid for the goods and services produced in a country. And so this money, if it's paying for goods and services, it's going to be paid to something. And the something to which it's going to be paid is capital, which we denote here with a K, and labor, which we denote here with an L. And then what you have is you have this W here. This is the average wage rate and hourly wage rate. And so the hourly wage rate multiplied by the number of hours worked gives the total amount paid in salaries in a country in a year. And here you have capital times the return to capital. So how much dollars per dollars of capital you get as a revenue, and if you multiply the two, you get the total amount paid to the owners of capital. So basically, when consumers are paying for economic goods, the money they're paying ultimately ends up in the pockets either of the owners of capital, the owners of machines and vehicles and buildings, or it ends up in the pockets of the workers who are doing the work. Now, in this graph, what you have is the relative proportion of each two of these payments, in the case of Portugal, but with a pattern which is similar for many countries. And where you have, this is a percentage in the vertical axis, and you have along the last 60 years, since 1960, the fraction of GDP that was paid to capital, and you see that it's mostly around 30, with just a big blip here. And you can understand this blip because Portugal up to 1974 was a right-wing dictatorship, and then there was a left-wing revolution. And not unexpectedly, when you get a left-wing revolution against the right-wing regime, no one's paying money to the capitalists, but that's just something that lasted a few years, and it then rebounded back to its original value of 30%. And then the payments to labor, the counterpart of that is 70%. So a long time, roughly speaking, of GDP, 1/3 is paid to the owners of capital and 2/3 is paid to the workers. Okay, now there's a moment where I introduce the central puzzle that's puzzling economists and that we use thermodynamics and energy science to shed light on. And it is the issue that if labor is getting 2/3 of GDP and capital is getting 1/3 of GDP, then if you build up a weighted average of the amount of capital and the amount of labor you have in an economy, you can see how capital and labor are contributing to the creation of GDP. But if you do that, you get this red line, and you see that this red line is growing much slower than GDP. So basically the problem is, the central conundrum in economics is that only capital and a priori, only capital and labor can explain the creation of economic value, because they are the only ones that get paid for, with salaries, interest, rent, dividends. But however, when you calculate their weighted contribution to the economy a long time, it increases much slower than GDP. And so this gap is a puzzle in economics. Where does it come from? Why a long time do capital and labor have a greater and greater capacity for producing GDP? One of the explanations, and which you can see explains a little bit, is this green line, where you now take into account that labor is not something homogeneous, and these hours of worked by labor, they change a long time because of schooling and skills. So as time goes by, more and more people have a higher level of education, more and more people go to university. And then when this happens, as time goes by, you get this weighted contribution is changing faster. But you still have a significant gap, which you see over here. And so the nutshell of the problem is that the main source of economic growth, which comes from this gap, which is called total factor productivity, is unknown. And although economists have come up with this nice name for it, called total factor productivity, and it's called total factor productivity. The total there means it's when you consider capital and labor taken together, it's that supposedly capital and labor are now being used in a more productive way. But that's, as this famous economist said long ago, but it's still true. In fact, this quotation is still used nowadays all the time by economists. Effectively, just calling it total factor productivity is just a way of disguising the fact that we don't know what it's really all about. And so what we will explore here is whether energy could be an explanatory factor for total factor productivity, coming from the insight that essentially in humanity, economic growth, massive economic growth as we know it today, was invented in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution, and it went in waves. Country after country started having significant economic growth after they went through an industrial revolution. And it is clear that industrial revolutions are closely connected to the use of energy and to the use of machines. It is basically machines that intuitively we know explain economic growth, because it is machines that allow people to become more productive, and so allow workers in a certain amount of time to produce more and more. And machines are essentially and above all energy conversion devices. Without energy, there are no machines. And so maybe there's something associated to energy that would allow us to explain what capital and labor cannot explain. To do this, and notice that this idea that energy should be something that should be used to explain economic growth has been around for many decades, even maybe a century. But people were never able to really find a tight connection between energy and economic growth. And what happened was that in the 80s and in the 90s, two groups, initially independently and then collaborating. So the research group of Rainer Kümmel in Germany and of Bob Ayres, first in the US, in Carnegie Mellon, and then in France, in INSEAD in Paris. They hit on the idea that there was a particular way of measuring energy flows in economies that was the one that would make sense to relate to energy. And that's what I'm now going to talk about. What is this way of measuring energy? It does allow us to make a connection between energy and the creation of economic value. And so let's just go. If we talk about energy, we have to talk about the laws of thermodynamics. Just let's review them fast. First law, in any physical process, energy is conserved. As Lavoisier said, before literally losing his head in the French Revolution, in nature, nothing is created, nothing is lost, everything changes. And energy is one of those things. It's always conserved. But it's conserved, but it also changes. In any physical process, something called entropy increases, giving us a degradation of energy, which is expressed as an increase in entropy. To give a practical example, we will all say that when we switch on a lamp, the lamp is consuming electricity. That statement is wrong because energy is conserved, so a lamp cannot consume energy. But a lamp is degrading energy. It's reducing its capacity to do work. And so we define something called exergy, which is the capacity to do work. And we say that the incoming electricity to the lamp has a higher exergy, a higher capacity to do work than the heat and light coming out of the lamp. And so in fact, the informal and obviously in an intuitive sense, correct statement that a lamp consumes energy, the correct way of saying it is that a lamp consumes exergy. A lamp consumes the capacity of energy to exert work, and hence the explanation for the X you see over there. Exergy is the capacity of energy to exert work and to do useful things. Okay, another concept or another set of concepts that we need to understand what's going on with energy in our economies is the concept of stages of transformation of energies. And so think first about what we call the primary stage. And the primary stage is where we have energy in a form where no human action on it has yet occurred. And this would be, think about the coal, but you have to think about the coal underground before we've even discovered it, and much less built a mine to extract it. Then we do discover the coal, we build the mine, we extract the coal, we transport it to a power station, and in the power station, it is transformed into electricity. Electricity, we say, is at the final stage, and by definition, the final stage is the last moment where an economic agent pays for an energy flow. So at home, we all pay for electricity. The second law of thermodynamics guarantees that there is entropy production in all transformations. And this entropy production, as I've mentioned, is synonymous with destruction of exergy, destruction of the capacity to exert work. And this destruction, I've expressed it here with this shadowed arrow to exemplify that the initial exergy that we had in the coal, which is the width of this arrow, part of that exergy will come out as electricity. Part of it will come out as heat coming out of the power plant. And in fact, we could still do something with this heat, but part of the exergy is destroyed. The capacity to do work will no longer be there. Now, this electricity goes into a light bulb, and out of the light bulb comes light. And light is what satisfies human needs. And so that's what we call the useful stage. And it's not only what satisfies human needs, but it is what is associated to the creation of economic value. And so that's why we focus on useful exergy when relating energy with economic value. Additionally, just to give an extra argument, it's important for you to notice that once I have a lamp in my room and and it's on and it's lighting the room, it's providing a service to me. It allows me to read a book or whatever. But that after providing that service, all of this light will be absorbed by the walls and will end up as heat. It will be completely degraded. All the exergy will be lost. So in fact, this useful stage is the last stage where thermodynamics makes any sense, because after this stage, energy is completely degraded, and we're now in the realm of preferences and human behavior, and so we're clearly in the realm of economics. So what I want to try to persuade you in this slide is that if the correct boundary for making the relation between thermodynamics and economics is here at the useful stage. Up to that point, it's meaningful to talk about thermodynamic phenomena, but after that, we're in the realm of economics. Okay, another point just to say, a very relevant point, is that all energies are equal, but some are more equal than others, meaning that although we measure heat and work in the same units, work can be completely converted to heat, but heat cannot be completely converted to work, which is a consequence of the second law of thermodynamics, and which tells us that we have to add up heat and work in the correct way. And exergy allows us to do this because it converts the heat into the equivalent amount of work that we can get out of it. Exergy destruction expresses the second law of thermodynamics. It is equivalent to entropy production. And finally, the argument I was been mentioning, that the useful stage of energy transformation is the one closest to the creation of economic value. And so you have the explanation for why we're going to try to understand economic growth, the creation of economic value, using energy measured in a specific way, which is useful exergy. Let's just see a little bit in practice how we get the numbers for this. So now here on the lower part of the slide, we have exactly the scheme that you saw before. And just for you to have some intuitive feel of what we're talking about, at the primary level, we're talking about things like biomass, natural gas, coal, renewable electricity, oil, and something important, especially prior to industrialization, which is food for people and feed for working animals. Then we go into the final stage, and we have things like electricity, oil products like gasoline and diesel, things like that. And then we go into the useful stage, where we have a conceptually very different set of categories, because now we're talking about the ways that exergy can be useful for us. It can be useful for us by delivering mechanical work, which we distinguish in two ways: mechanical work delivered by people and working animals like oxen and horses, and that's muscle work. And we have mechanical drive, which is mechanical work delivered by machines. Then we have light and other electrical uses. And finally, we have heat. And so these are the big categories of useful exergy that is used for the creation of economic value and for the satisfaction of human needs. Let's see an example of how this looks like for Portugal along 150 years. This choice of a time frame of 150 years is significant because it is a time frame that allows us to cover an initial situation in the 1850s, where Portugal is still an agricultural economy, where most of the energy is either food for people and feed for working animals, and it's combustible renewables, so basically wood burnt at home for heating and cooking, and in some small artisanal transformation. Then you see here an increase in coal, which is a timid first industrial revolution in Portugal. If you were to see this for England, this peak of coal would be up there at 90%. So that was a real first industrial revolution. Portugal mostly missed out on the first industrial revolution. And then in the 50s, you see the second industrial revolution happening in Portugal with the entry of the electrical motor and electricity, and the entry of the internal combustion engine using oil products. so gasoline and diesel. And then you see this massive increase in the two things. Now you can see also, we can now also see what these things are being used for. So we look at this at the useful stage, and we see that in the agricultural economy, most of the useful stage is muscle work done by people and by horses and oxen. So that's the main thing driving an agricultural economy. Now, as we go through this process of a timid but still existing first industrial revolution, heat starts having a little bit more weight and muscle work goes down. And then you see the big difference in the 1950s with the entry of the electrical motor and the internal combustion engine, which is that you see a lot of mechanical work coming up and replacing the muscle work, which is also physical work. And you see that it now becomes predominant. And this is in fact, and we're now starting to relate to the puzzle of economic growth, this is the moment when electricity and the internal combustion engine allow us to deliver massive amounts of mechanical work. This is the moment when we start having significant economic growth. Now, in the previous two slides, we saw the categories. Now we see the totals. So you see for the same 150 years in petajoules, the total amount of final exergy delivered delivered in Portugal, and you see the total amount of useful exergy. By the second law of thermodynamics, the final is transformed into the useful. There is necessarily exergy destruction, and so the useful is necessarily lower than the final. And we can take the ratio of these two lines, and this ratio gives us an efficiency. And sorry, the efficiency is going to come in a second. Let me show you something before that. So we have the final exergy and the useful exergy here. And now what we do is we divide each of these by GDP. So essentially, we're now starting to make the jump from energy to economics and to answer our central and initial puzzles. And so we divide both of these time series by the GDP time series, and then you get the two lines you see here. And the results that you see here are extremely striking, and they confirm empirically what I was before defending conceptually. And which is that if you see here, there's this lower line here, the red line is useful exergy divided by GDP, and you see that it is roughly constant. So along 150 years of economic history, from an agricultural economy over here to an industrial economy over here and to a services economy over here, what you strikingly see, it is that you always need the same amount of useful exergy per unit of GDP. And roughly the number is 1 megajoule of exergy per euro of GDP, euro in prices of 2010. So the constancy of this line gives the empirical underpinning for my previous arguments that it is at the useful stage, that it is the useful stage that has a clear connection to the creation of economic value. And now you see it. That's what it is. 1 megajoule per unit of economic value, per euro. On the other hand, final exergy, which is in fact what most people are looking at when they look at energy and economy, you see that it changes a lot. In fact, it decreases. And the other point of this graph is to show you that if you were to look only at the final of this ratio of final exergy to GDP, you might think that decoupling was happening, that we need less and less energy for the creation of GDP, and which is in a sense true. We need less and less final exergy, but in terms of what matters, in terms of energy delivering something useful, you see that it's still constant. Okay, we come back to our original lines, and now we come back to what I thought I was going to be talking about just a few minutes ago, which is now we do something different with these two lines. We are now going to take the ratio of these two lines, and the ratio of these two lines is the aggregate energy efficiency of the economy. This is one of the advantages of using exergy, which is that we can meaningfully compare very different machines, such as an air conditioner or the internal combustion engine in a car, or the electrical motor in a car. All of them can be measured with the same benchmark, which is what we call an exergy efficiency. And when we take the ratio of these two lines, we get an average exergy efficiency. What we're going to get is the average efficiency of all the machines in the country. And that's what we get. It's what you see in this graph. And what you see is that same period, 1850 to the present, vertical scale goes 0 to 25%. The absolute scale is 0 to 100%. So because the useful efficiency by the useful exergy by the second law of thermodynamics has to be lower than the final. So this number is necessarily lower than 100%. In fact, it's operating here at lower values. And what you see is that in the agricultural economy, mostly with burning wood, using our own muscle power and the muscle power of oxen and horses, you see a low efficiency of 7%. That doesn't change a lot until the 1950s. And then it has a massive jump along 30 years. And this massive jump is mostly associated to the entry of the electrical motor. It's the second industrial revolution. And the electrical motor makes this jump up dramatically because the electrical motor has efficiencies between 70 and 90%, completely off the scale that you see here. So even a comparatively small weight of the electrical motor in the system changes this completely. And this is the period 1950 to 1980. This is a period of enormous economic growth, but this is exactly the period, and analogously in the US, from 1900 to 1960, it's the period of the second industrial revolution, which has been clearly identified, namely in a famous book by Robert Gordon, has the most significant period of economic growth in the US. In fact, it has been identified as the period of most significant economic growth in all countries as they develop. It's the period of the second industrial revolution. It's the period when the electrical motor comes in. It is the period when the aggregate energy efficiency of the economy goes up. And so we have here our second clear sign of a strong connection between energy and economic growth.
Tiago, let me ask a question from the chat here.
Yep, Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, and so the question is really about how confident are you in the data going back to 1850 and doing this analysis so long ago? What can you say about the data and the quality of the data and your confidence in this, doing the analysis on those data?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I guess the question is coming from a central point, which is that both the energy data and the economic data, they've been systematically collected only for the last decades. And so what we're talking about here is a lot of this data is estimates made by energy historians and economic historians based on multiple sources of data. Now, obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty here, but what gives us some confidence in what's going on is that the same pattern that we see, that you're seeing now here for Portugal, we and other authors have seen for other countries for multiple time periods. We see it for the UK in the last 300 years. We see it for 15 European countries in the last 50 years. And this is always happening with independent data sources. So this, although there is uncertainty in each time series, as a whole, the conclusions that we're getting at, they seem quite solid because they're coming from multiple sources of data. Coming back to this time series, so from after 1980, this efficiency increase stagnates. Economic growth in Portugal stagnates. And this is just slightly late compared to the US, UK, Germany, France, where this stagnation, both energy and economic, started in the 70s. And so we have this general pattern for all countries that once aggregate energy efficiency stops growing, economic growth may keep on going, but at a much slower rate. And here you have a comparison between two things, which is and now this is only for the last 50 years. And in fact, this connects to the question that Carrie just asked on behalf of the audience, which is for the last 50 years, the data are better because they're already associated to more systematic collection by statistics offices. And what you see here now is just the last 50 years of the efficiency graph that I showed you. You see the efficiency coming up and then stopping around the 1980s. And you see total factor productivity also going up fast and then stagnating. And in fact, we can do a careful statistical analysis of this, and we come to the conclusion that total factor productivity can be written, it's what you see over here, total factor productivity can be written as the energy efficiency raised to an exponent. And now we go for what I call the third stylized fact, the third sign of the connection between energy and economic growth. And so we come back to our original graph where we had this gap between the contribution of capital and labor and the observed growth of GDP, this graph and this gap being what we call total factor productivity growth. And what we've found is that just like we can correct labor for its schooling level, we can also correct capital for its energy delivering capacity. We can correct capital for its capacity to deliver useful exergy. Effectively, we shift from measuring capital using money, and we shift to measuring it by measuring its capacity to deliver and to control energy. And we get a measure that we call energy corrected capital. And as you can see, once we have this measure of energy corrected capital, we basically explain all of TFP. All of total factor productivity. And in the end, we get we can express this way, which is we now have capital, which is a function of useful exergy, and that's the important part here of the useful exergy made available for each worker. So useful exergy divided by L, and this corrected capital measure we can bring it in to the aggregate production function, and we now get a GDP calculation which is close to the observed one. And to explain this last stylized fact, in fact combining two of the stylized facts that I've mentioned, I'll explain this to you in a simple story which I call the parable of the English farmer. And so what you should start by doing is imagine this farmer here. Imagine that what you see in this photograph would be a farmer in England 300 years ago, and the farmer works the land with one horse, and he's not very productive in his activity, and he's basically able to feed his family. And for this reason, simplification of course, but for this reason, all of the English 300 years ago were farmers, because each of them could only feed their own family. Now you fast forward to the present, and the farmer is now working the land with a 100 horsepower tractor, which literally means that in the engine of this tractor, the farmer is now controlling the power of 100 horses. And the farmer is 100 times more productive. And we know he's 100 times more productive because now only 1% of the English are farmers, and the other 99% are doing something else, because just one English farmer can now produce food for 100 people. And so this is a simple example to show you that measuring capital physically based on its energy delivery capacity allows us to measure its contribution to production. So the tractor is physically 100 times more productive than a horse. Why and where does economics go astray? Because for economists, the relative value of a capital item is expressed by its price. And this tractor might cost, a 100 horsepower tractor might cost nowadays $30,000. And the horse for working the land might cost $3,000. So for an economist, the tractor is 10 times more productive than the horse. But physically, we know that it is 100 times more productive. And that's why we solve the puzzle in economics. It's by using energy-corrected capital, as you saw here in this graph. We are measuring capital by physically and not economically, and we're able to correctly measure its economic value creation capacity. Okay, so summing up, standard economics will say that GDP is a function of capital and labor and something unknown called total factor productivity. And what we found here is that GDP is proportional to useful exergy. We found that that total factor productivity, which is a mystery for economists, can in fact be explained in terms of the aggregate energy efficiency of the economy, which we measure in this way, final to useful exergy efficiency. And then we have this complementarity. We have this relation that I've been showing you, which is that we can calculate an effective capital based on energy. And with using this capital, this K hat, we can bring it here and we can create a production function, an aggregate production function, where now GDP is just a function of capital and labor. This is the energy corrected capital that I was mentioning before. And you see that now the TFP has disappeared. We are now capable of describing GDP just based on capital and labor, and we no longer need this mysterious total factor productivity. This, and this is a bit, I've already hinted a bit at this in answering the question that Carrie raised. These stylized facts, these patterns that I've been showing you, they have been generalized to different countries in different studies. And so, for example, that useful exergy is proportional to GDP. We've found it for the UK along 300 years. We've found it for 15 European countries along 50 years. With a relevant detail, which is also significant, which is that we have to separate one component of useful exergy, which is high temperature heat. And high temperature heat is what you use for steel and iron and ceramics and bricks and glass. And you can understand why it makes sense that you have to separate it, because this useful exergy flow is not directly used for creating economic value, it's used for building capital. So it's special in that sense. It is also special in the sense that, in contrast to the general idea that I told you in the beginning, that when we are at the useful stage, so when we're looking at useful stage, we're looking at the last stage, and that after that energy is completely degraded. That is not the case when you are making cement or bricks or glass. In that case, your useful exergy flow, part of it is physically embodied in the material item coming out of your process. So this is basically, I'm telling you why it makes sense that high temperature heat has to be considered separately. We didn't have to do that for Portugal because in Portugal's industrialization process, a lot of these things, machines and cars and vehicles, were imported. They were not made in Portugal, and so they were not using a lot of high temperature heat. That aggregate energy efficiency has a strong effect on total factor productivity and hence on growth has been found also for Ghana and the UK on a different time scale, also for also just for the UK with a different methodological approach. And that energy corrected capital explains total factor productivity. We've found this is still ongoing work, but we're finding it also for the 15 European countries that I mentioned up there. Okay. Implications for this. One of the implications, and you've heard about this from Paul Brockway in a previous seminar in this series, which is that since energy efficiency is closely connected to economic growth, that means that when you have energy efficiency policies, which are a good idea, but they do have this potential for backfiring, because With greater energy efficiency, you would expect to consume less primary energy, but greater energy efficiency leads to greater economic growth. And because greater economic growth implies greater energy consumption, in the end, one thing overwhelms the other, and you can have a backfire situation where after increasing energy efficiency, you end up with more energy consumption than before. And if you look on the big time frame, the big picture that I was giving to you when motivating why we should look at energy when considering the process of economic growth, you see that this is basically the energy economic history of the last 300 years. We invented economic growth through the use of machines powered by energy, and the more efficient we made those machines, the more economic growth we had, and so the more energy consumption we had. It was never the case that because of having more efficient machines, that overall in the economy as a whole, we had decreasing energy consumption. We also see that it's the flip side, that the timid decoupling between energy and economic growth that we've been seeing in developed countries in the last decades is intrinsically associated to slow economic growth. It's a direct consequence. You decouple when energy efficiency is not growing, and so you also don't have a lot of economic growth. Maybe that's the only choice we have. That's the big open problem in terms of policy and in terms of decisions for humanity that comes out of this type of studies. The hope, and it is there, the hope, with caveats, but it is the hope, is that we've meanwhile, since the 70s, we had the third industrial revolution with information and communication technology. And the interesting thing, as Robert Solow, famous economist who in fact discovered total factor productivity growth, as Robert Solow quipped in the 90s, he said, well, we can see the information revolution everywhere except in the economic statistics. And so in fact, the information and communications technology revolution didn't have a big impact on economic growth. Maybe that's because it was essentially associated to that just manipulating information. And maybe the fourth industrial revolution, which is about robotics, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, things like that, maybe it will lead to a different outcome because it's more of a connection between information and machines and the material world. At the same time, maybe with the fourth industrial revolution, we can have information. We can have, well, and we see it happening, which is that we have computers and algorithms and artificial intelligence algorithms. We have them replacing the information processing capacities of humans, just like in the first and second industrial revolutions, we had machines replacing the muscle work of people and of animals. And so it might be possible that in the fourth industrial revolution, we can start creating value, a lot of economic value, and increasing the productivity of workers in terms of information processing. And the advantage of information processing is that it requires much less energy than machines. And so we could have information-driven economic growth. Just a caveat, I would say it's possible, but there's a caveat and there's a threat, and you can see it expressed in this graph from The Economist from a few months ago, which shows from 1960 to nowadays, it shows the computing power used in training artificial intelligence systems. And what you see, and notice that the vertical scale is logarithmic. So what you see is an exponential line, but which in fact accelerates because the slope is now higher in terms of the computing power used to train AI systems. And if you need more computing power for artificial intelligence, that means you need more energy, and it's accelerating. So the hope that the fourth industrial revolution will help us in the transition to sustainability also relies on finding intelligent, in fact, and pun intended, intelligent artificial intelligence algorithms, because the current ones are quite dumb and they require a lot of calculation and a lot of energy to create artificial intelligence. And so this won't in the long run be the way to go if we want to create economic value using information, but without being energy intensive. There are, however, reasons for hope here, because we do know that it is possible to have much more efficient information processing in terms of the energy required. And we know that because of our brains. Our brains exists, of course, there's an existing technology, and in our brains, we know that they are much more efficient in terms of energy for information processing. So we know that in principle, it should be possible to have computing systems that are much less energy intensive, but that's a major area of research. It's completely open, and it probably requires completely new paradigms in the area of artificial intelligence to have ways of doing information processing and having artificial intelligence, which is not energy intensive. And so basically coming to our general approach here, in fact, the looking at this for the future and for the sustainability transition, we need to enlarge the scope of our approach to consider not just thermodynamics, but also information processing. And it is looking at this that then will allow us to understand whether decoupling between energy and economic growth is possible, and in what ways, and with each and with which policies. If it turns out for the worse, and if turning out for the worst means if we don't find any way in the future of breaking the patterns from the past of the relation between energy and economic growth, then we have a problem, because the only way to have a sustainability transition would be with slow, zero, or negative economic growth. And although there are many reasons for thinking that we could supply human needs with zero or negative economic growth, and it might be possible to do that transition, we also know, and we've seen it from the economic stagnation of the last decades, we've seen the social and economic problems that this stagnation has created in the developed countries where the stagnation has been occurring. Okay, and with that, I'm finished and I'm open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. So there's one question here just asking how to look up some of the references. I think you had some on some slides, but maybe you could say whether they're easily findable on your website or something like this.
Yeah, they should be here on some of the slides, or you can also just look them up on my Google Scholar profile.
Okay. Here's one question, which is referencing your discussion of generally total factor productivity in the study by Robert Gordon and the idea of stagnating total factor productivity. So you looked at several technologies and their efficiency increases in terms of converting final exergy to useful exergy. So the question here is, in terms of an outlook, the question is, how can you anticipate further changes in those same factors going into the future? I guess my interpretation here might be, how do we think about the limits to increasing efficiency? You talked about information and this in your conclusions. So maybe we've done that, but what about just increases in efficiency? That's me adding on to this question, but
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
In a sense, maybe now building on that question, before going to information, I would mention things like the electrical motor, for example, which was the main source of increase in efficiency with the second industrial revolution, but that was the electrical motor in factories and in homes. And we now have, with the electrification of transport, we can expect increased efficiencies through those machines associated to transport. So that's one opportunity for increased efficiency in the future. in fact, it's kind of it's the main opportunity to make efficiency start increasing again. And then, in fact, it's the point that I mentioned towards the end, and that you've mentioned, Carrie, which is the issue of information. It in a sense, it's my guess is the best way to break out of this is that it's no longer increasing exactly the efficiency I was showing, but it's making another different efficiency, making it relevant, which is the efficiency of our energy efficiency in delivering useful information. Now, not useful exergy, but useful information. What I mean by useful information, it's not just having massive computer power, but it's having computer power that is in fact able to increase the productivity of workers with robots or with autonomous vehicles, where you do have a combination with the electrification of the powertrain, but it's also something else. And then you have the issue of being able to have productivity increases in the services sector, in things like healthcare, taking care of the elderly, which is
I think we've lost Tiago, so hopefully we'll see if he can come back quickly. Oh,
Carrie.
Tiago, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, we lost you for maybe 20 seconds. Go ahead.
So, okay, so I was probably, you lost me when I was talking about very important sectors for the future associated to services. So education, healthcare, and taking care of the elderly. And these are very labor intensive sectors. And they're required, I mean, especially the healthcare and taking care of the elderly, and also with the dementia crisis that we're going to have in developed countries as people start being above 90 years old. So there's going to be massive amounts of elderly people requiring assistance. And basically, we won't have a labor force which is enough to adequately take care of these people. In fact, I don't know how the situation is in the US, but in Europe, and especially in Portugal, we clearly have a situation which was laid bare now with the COVID crisis, but it was there all along. We already, for the number of elderly we have now, we are not taking adequate care of them. And so it's even going to be more difficult to take care of more elderly as the fraction of elderly people in the population goes up. And so the issue is that we could think of having the creation of economic value also associated with better care, healthcare, better care for the elderly, better education, associated to the use of artificial intelligence, robotics, and that would be a way of delivering value mostly through information. And not so much through energy, but with automation. So maybe just summing up the idea here is that we need to have automation, low energy automation, and so that would be a possibility for decoupling. And with low energy automation is associated to information processing primordially, and not to the delivery of mechanical work like the machines of the first and second industrial revolution.
Does that mean we'd have to essentially redefine our metric of economic growth away from GDP as we have in the past? And we might still call it GDP, but it's actually some different number?
Not necessarily. I mean, I'm friendly with the idea that one way of tackling the problems, and which it's not the one I took here today in this seminar, but I'm friendly with the idea of tackling our problems by thinking about different metrics of human welfare in our economies. So I think that that's certainly a direction in which we need to go. But I wouldn't, but having said that, I wouldn't say that we need to throw away GDP, because the issue is that what I just described before about health, care for the elderly, and education, it's something that can still be reflected in GDP. So it's not, using GDP as a metric is not necessarily a problem. We just have to use it adequately and calculate it correctly. Still saying that it's good to look at other metrics of human welfare in our societies, obviously.
Right. I'll ask another question here. So your aggregate efficiency that you discussed in your presentation was final exergy divided by, or useful exergy divided by final exergy, rather than useful exergy divided by primary exergy. So can you say more about why you think that's the important metric. Why not use primary energy? And does this have some implication for understanding what you already hinted at, which is, say, going low carbon and let's just say using more wind and solar electricity technologies versus combustible generation technologies?
Okay, so it's good to look at this graph here to be looking at what we're talking about. And the issue is that, well, the first part of the answer is that it doesn't make a lot of difference, because the big things are happening when we go from final to useful. It's when we're making all these conversions from energy carriers into useful energy flows. When going from primary to final, essentially the two big things that are happening is that we're talking about refineries where crude oil is transformed into gasoline and diesel, but this is not very significant from the energy point of view. And then in fact, so the main thing which is happening when you go from primary to final is the use of coal and natural gas and oil for the production of electricity. So that's essentially the main thing. Once we go into renewables, the difference between primary and final, in fact, becomes negligible, just like it was negligible before we started using fossil fuels to produce electricity. So that's the first line of argument. The second line of argument is that, in fact, accounting for primary energy is very problematic, because whilst it's reasonably unequivocal how you should account for final and for useful, primary energy has a lot of different possible conventions with different conceptualizations of how to do it. Do you do it according to the physical content, or do you do it, and then it's tricky because, for example, renewable electricity, you would have to look at the energy which is in the wind blowing against the wind turbine, or you would look at the energy which is in the water in the dam. And so many of these things are problematic. And so that's the second reason. There are accounting problems with the primary stage that you don't have with the final stage. And the third argument is the last one I say, because it wouldn't be the one that would be the decisive one, but which is pragmatic, which is we did it with final to useful for the reasons I said before, the first two, but then in the end, the results are very good, which is a kind of final confirmation that it is final to useful efficiency that's driving things.
Right. I think I'll just make a comment here as we close up, emphasize what you said there in your answer. And that's what excites me about this type of research you're talking about, which is if you're going to relate energy to economic growth or some economic factor, it is much less arbitrary and much more well-defined to use useful energy and final energy rather than primary. It's just less ambiguity in the decision-making of the analyst itself. And that's what also, and that it gives good results is also strikingly powerful. So thanks for clarifying that. And I think with that, we will conclude the session. So Tiago, thank you very much for a very well organized, thoughtful, and I think very insightful presentation. I think this is a great discussion of the topic for people interested in this area. So thank you very much for joining us today.
And thank you for having me.